What if I told you that everything you know about Ferdinand Magellan's death is a lie? That the man who killed him wasn't just some tribal chief, but a brilliant strategist who outsmarted the greatest explorer of his time? Prepare to have your mind blown. April 27, 1521. The shores of Mactan Island. A Portuguese explorer lies dying in the shallow waters, his grand dreams of circumnavigating the globe crushed by a warrior whose name would echo through history. But this isn't the story they taught you in school. The history books paint Lapu-Lapu as a savage native who got lucky. They are wrong, dead wrong. Ferdinand Magellan wasn't just any explorer. This man had convinced the Spanish crown to fund the most ambitious voyage in human history. He'd survived mutinies, storms, and starvation. He'd discovered a passage through South America that mapmakers said was impossible. This was a man who bent the world to his will. So how did he end up face down in Filipino waters? But here's what nobody tells you. Magellan didn't come to the Philippines to explore. He came to conquer, and he'd already begun. 3 weeks before his death, Magellan had landed on Cebu Island. The local chief, Humabon, welcomed him with open arms. Gifts were exchanged, smiles all around. But Magellan had an agenda that would change everything. Within days, he'd convinced Humabon to convert to Christianity. Not just him, but his entire kingdom. 800 Filipinos were baptized in a single ceremony. Magellan had found his golden ticket, a local ruler who would help him claim these islands for Spain. And this is where everything changed. Magellan looked at his maps and saw $sign. These islands sat right on the spice route, the most valuable trade network in the world. Whoever controlled these waters controlled unimaginable wealth. But there was one problem standing in his way. Across the narrow channel, on Mactan Island, lived a chief who refused to bow. His name was Lapu-Lapu. Now, here's where the story gets twisted by history. Most accounts describe Lapu-Lapu as some primitive tribal leader who stumbled into greatness. But what if I told you he was actually a master of psychological warfare? When Magellan's messengers arrived demanding tribute, Lapu-Lapu didn't just refuse. He sent back a message that was pure genius. If Magellan wants my allegiance, let him come and take it himself. This wasn't bravado, this was strategy. Lapu-Lapu knew exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. Magellan's ego had carried him halfway around the world. The challenge wasn't just an insult, it was carefully crafted bait. But here's the shocking part. Magellan fell for it completely. On April 26, 1521, Magellan made the decision that would end his life. He would personally lead an assault on Mactan Island. His men tried to talk him out of it. Even Humabon offered to send Filipino warriors to do the fighting. But Magellan refused. Why? Because this wasn't about conquest anymore. This was personal. What nobody tells you is that Magellan saw this as his moment of triumph. He was walking into a trap. The night before the battle, Lapu-Lapu gathered his warriors. But he wasn't giving them a pep talk about honor or courage. He was giving them a masterclass in tactical warfare. Lapu-Lapu had studied Magellan's weapons, his fighting style, his weaknesses. He knew the Spanish fought in tight formations with heavy armor and gunpowder weapons, devastating in open battle, but useless in the wrong terrain. And Lapu-Lapu controlled the terrain. April 27th, dawn. Magellan approached Mactan with 3 boats and 60 men. He was expecting a quick, decisive victory. What he found was his worst nightmare. The shoreline was shallow for hundreds of yards. His boats couldn't get close. His cannons were useless. His heavily armored men had to wade through chest-deep water while Filipino archers rained arrows down on them from the beach. But this is where the real genius showed. Lapu-Lapu didn't meet them at the water's edge like a typical warrior would. He waited. He let them struggle ashore, exhausted and disoriented. Then he struck. What happened next changed the course of history. The Spanish accounts say they were outnumbered 3-1, but Filipino oral traditions tell a different story. They say Lapu-Lapu used the island's geography like a weapon. Narrow passages that broke up Spanish formation, dense vegetation that negated their firearm advantage, tide pools that turned their heavy armor into death traps. This wasn't a primitive tribe fighting with sticks and stone. This was asymmetric warfare at its finest. And then, in the chaos of battle, Lapu-Lapu made his move. The Spanish say Magellan was struck down by a random spear thrust. But Filipino accounts are far more specific. They say Lapu-Lapu himself delivered the killing blow, targeting the one gap in Magellan's armor that he'd identified beforehand. One thrust, one moment. The age of exploration changed forever. But here's what really happened next, and why it matters more than you think. With Magellan dead, his expedition should have been over. They'd lost their leader, their navigator, their entire reason for being there. But something incredible happened instead. The survivors, led by Juan Sebastian Elcano, limped away from the Philippines and continued west. They island hopped across the Indian Ocean, rounded Africa, and 18 months later, 18 skeletal men sailed into Spanish waters. They had circumnavigated the globe. But here's the twist that history buried. They only succeeded because Lapu-Lapu let them go. Think about it. Lapu-Lapu had just defeated the most powerful military force his people had ever seen. He could have hunted down the survivors, captured their ships, ended Spanish presence in the Philippines forever. But he didn't. Why? Because Lapu-Lapu understood something that most warriors never grasp. Sometimes the greatest victory comes from showing mercy to your enemy. By letting the Spanish survivors escape, he sent a message that would echo across 2 continents. Spain now knew that the Philippines weren't defenseless islands waiting to be conquered. They were defended by warriors who could outfight and outthink European armies. And this is where everything changes again. For the next 50 years, Spain barely touched the Philippines. When they finally returned in force, they came not as conquerors, but as negotiators. They established trade partnerships instead of forced subjugation. They built alliances instead of imposing rule. Lapu-Lapu's victory at Mactan didn't just save his island. It shaped how colonialism would unfold across the entire Pacific. But what nobody tells you is how this story ends. Lapu-Lapu vanished from historical records after 1521. No death date, no grave, no final battle. He simply disappeared. Spanish chronicles mention him fighting other battles, but the details are vague and contradictory. Filipino oral traditions claim he lived for decades more, becoming a legendary figure who appeared whenever his people needed him most. Some say he was buried in a secret cave on Mactan Island. Others claim he sailed away to live in exile. The most intriguing theory? That Lapu-Lapu wasn't even his real name, but a title passed down through generations of resistance leaders. What if the man who killed Magellan was just the first in a long line of warriors who took on the name Lapu-Lapu whenever foreign invaders threatened their home? Here's what we know for certain. After Magellan's death, every Spanish expedition to the Philippines approached with caution. They negotiated instead of demanding. They offered trade instead of tribute. They remembered what happened to the last European who underestimated Filipino resistance. Lapu-Lapu didn't just win a battle. He changed the rules of engagement for an entire century. And this brings us to the most shocking revelation of all. Modern historians have discovered something that rewrites everything. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that Lapu-Lapu wasn't some isolated island chief. He was part of a sophisticated trade network that stretched across Southeast Asia. His warriors used weapons and tactics learned from Chinese merchants, Malay traders, and Arab seafarers. When he faced Magellan, he wasn't drawing on primitive tribal warfare. He was using military knowledge gathered from across half the world. The man who killed Ferdinand Magellan wasn't David fighting Goliath. He was one master strategist outsmarting another. But here's the final twist that changes everything you thought you knew about this story. Magellan's death wasn't the end of European exploration in the Pacific. It was the beginning of something far more complex, because word of his defeat spread not just through Spanish courts, but through Filipino communities across thousands of islands. For the first time, scattered tribal leaders had proof that Europeans could be defeated. Lapu-Lapu's victory became the blueprint for resistance movements that would shape colonial history for the next 4 centuries. From the mountains of Luzon to the jungles of Mindanao, Filipino warriors studied what happened at Mactan. They learned that superior technology meant nothing without superior strategy. They discovered that knowing your enemy's weaknesses mattered more than matching their strengths. Lapu-Lapu didn't just kill an explorer. He planted the seeds of a resistance that would define a nation. Today, if you visit Mactan Island, you'll find a massive statue of Lapu-Lapu holding a sword toward the sea. Tourists take selfies with it, thinking they're posing with some ancient tribal chief. They have no idea they are standing next to one of history's greatest military strategists. The plaque beneath the statue reads, Lapu-Lapu, first Filipino to resist foreign invasion. But that doesn't capture the full truth. Lapu-Lapu wasn't just the first to resist. He was the first to prove that resistance could work. He showed that intelligence could triumph over technology, that strategy could overcome superior firepower, that a small island warrior could change the course of global history. 500 years later, his victory still echoes through every independence movement, every successful resistance against overwhelming odds, every David who refuses to bow to Goliath. Because on April 27, 1521, in the shallow waters of Mactan Island, Lapu-Lapu didn't just kill Ferdinand Magellan. He killed the myth that European conquest was inevitable. He proved that heroes aren't born from noble bloodlines or superior weapons. They are forged in the moment when someone decides that freedom matters more than safety, that dignity trumps survival, that some things are worth dying for. And sometimes, if you're smart enough and brave enough and just a little bit lucky, you don't have to die for them at all. Sometimes you get to live to see your enemy's ships disappear over the horizon, carrying the message that your land, your people, your way of life will not be conquered without a fight. That's the real story of Lapu-Lapu versus Magellan. Not a simple tale of native versus colonizer, but a masterclass in how courage, intelligence, and perfect timing can reshape the world. The next time someone tells you that history is written by the victors, remind them of this story. Because sometimes, the victors aren't who you think they are. And sometimes, the real victory isn't in the battle itself, but in the legend that battle creates. A legend that 500 years later, still inspires anyone who's ever been told they're too small, too weak, or too primitive to stand up to power. Lapu-Lapu proved them wrong, and his victory is still echoing today, in every person who refuses to surrender their freedom without a fight. That's the story history books won't tell you. But now you know the truth.